That's the part that was, for me, really terrifying. Because a part of my moving towards addiction was a desperation to be cared for, to be, this nurturing posture that, you get this shadowy taste of it in pornography and another acting out. And so that was the bit that was so terrifying when people were telling me, well, this is going to take time with your spouse. That line right there made my heart go 100 miles an hour, and I don't know if I can survive that. Which then the positive, so what was helpful was remembering that intimacy is not, first, it's not just sexual, it's not just sex, but intimacy is not just a thing that you have with your spouse. It's something that I was able to cultivate with safe men. And being able to cultivate actual intimacy with safe men was a game changer for me early in my recovery, and learning that that's actually, that's where I need to go with some of this stuff in this time period with this space for my life.
Right.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. On today's show, we're going to feature Dr. Greg Miller, our usual host, and he's got 3 guests that come directly from the Faithful and True staff, with Jim Farm, Russ Smidt, and Josh Moon. All of these gentlemen have compelling stories and are experienced counselors that work with our clients here at Faithful and True. They're going to talk about what was most helpful to them when they began their healing journey, and also what was not helpful as they started their healing journey. Here now is the Faithful and True podcast with Dr. Greg Miller.
So we're very glad that you are with us today, and what we're going to be talking about are some of the things that we are aware of that men have done early in recovery that were helpful, and those things that maybe they did early in recovery that they discovered weren't helpful. And joining me today is Russ Smidt. He's a part of the Faithful and True team here. He serves as a life coach. He's also someone that went through the program here, and he does individual work as well as works with his wife Susie, and they work with couples. And we also have Josh. Josh also came through the program here at Faithful and True. He serves as a pastoral counselor. He leads groups and works with individuals. And then we also have Jim Farm. He is our clinical director, and he works with individuals, couples, and also leads groups. So we are very glad that you are here. And like I said, Russ and myself and Josh, some of this will be what we know from clients, but some of this will be what we discovered in our own journeys of recovery. And then we also have Jim will be able to share with us some of the things he's learned from clients, things that were helpful and not helpful growing up, doing recovery. Also, not helpful growing up, I'm not wrong. So, just to begin with, what are some of the big things that you've heard men say that if they had it to do all over again, some things that they wish they could do differently?
I'll start with my own story. I know the first thing that happened with me is that I was so excited to come out of my isolation and secrecy that I felt like, well, we need to renew our vows. And so I was really pushing that with Susie, and she was in shock, right? And so she wasn't interested. And that was really off-putting to me, but it wasn't helpful in our relationship for me to be pushing for an instantaneous change in our relationship. And so that would be one thing.
Yeah, well, and even to expand that, I think one of the things that can be true is when men start to get honest, and they suddenly feel this great intimacy and connection, maybe for the first time or the first time in a while, and they do want to move forward in the relationship as quickly as possible. This can come from a sincere place. This can come from a desire to affirm the relationship, but as you've identified, it may not be that the coupleship is at a place where they can do that. And really what we would say is there needs to be more time so that couples can have a clearer sense of what they are committing to. And typically wives need more information in order to know whether or not they're going to be able to stay, and what that might look like if they choose to stay.
Well, yeah, I mean, all she knew was that I'd done all these things, and I piled on that on her, and she needed to see a lot of change in me before she'd even begin to think about any that. So it was really incongruent for me to do that, but at the time it seemed really natural.
Yeah. Were you aware of what was kind of motivating you to offer that so early?
Well, yeah, I was excited. I felt like you were saying, I've come out of the silence, and now you know me. Now you know all of me, and so I want to enter into this marriage again. Now that you know all of me. Well, she did know all of me, and but she didn't understand it, and she didn't know whether I was going to change in other ways. She was just literally in shock. So it was just not okay. But it was coming from an honest place of saying, look, let's start over. I'm starting over in my recovery. Let's start over in our marriage. And eventually we got to a point where that would have made sense to do that, but not in the first week.
Right. Well, maybe that's kind of a broad place to stay or to start is there are some great ideas. It's more about timing.
Yeah.
So eventually the renewing of the vows might be very meaningful for a couple, and we know a lot of couples that do that. I mean, we also know couples that choose not to do that as a part of their recovery. But it's more, it's not the right time to try to move something like that forward.
Yeah, and I would say it's also important to remember, this is Josh, for those of you. It's also important to remember that it can feel like rejection early in recovery, especially because you're trying to be known, you're trying finally to be honest, and it can feel like, wow, she's not willing to enter into that with me. When, what's true is Susie was obviously willing to do it and needed the space to be able to do it rightly, and the desperation not to be abandoned is a real need, and it's a natural thing to want that, and it's not something your wife can often provide in the early parts of recovery, and coming to terms with that is important.
So maybe that brings us to what is helpful. So maybe the thing that's not helpful is to expect too much too quickly, to rush towards some sort of reconciliation. I know that when Beth and Elizabeth did a podcast on what wasn't helpful for wives, one of the things that they talked about was it wasn't helpful to forgive too quickly. And a lot of times there is this rush on both persons' part to kind of move towards forgiveness quickly, hoping that that will put everything behind them. And one of the things that we know is it just doesn't work that way. We don't put all of this behind us quickly. And in fact, there's some things that we don't ever want to put behind us. We want to continue to carry with us. But to be able to acknowledge it just takes time. And so for men to be patient and kind and generous, and to be willing to engage the journey with their spouse in whatever form it may look like. I often tell men one of the best things you can do is not try to predict the future in your relationship based upon what's happening in the present. Because you may be having a great moment and the next moment may be difficult. Or you may be having a very painful, difficult moment and the next moment may be good. And so helping men to understand one of the things that you can expect early in relationship and recovery is that it's going to be uncertain.
Yeah, but that's the part that was, for me, really terrifying. Because a part of my moving towards addiction was a desperation to be cared for, to be, this nurturing posture that, you get this shadowy taste of it in pornography and another acting out. And so that was the bit that was so terrifying when people were telling me, well, this is going to take time with your spouse. That line right there made my heart go 100 miles an hour, and I don't know if I can survive that. Which then the positive, so what was helpful was remembering that intimacy is not, first, it's not just sexual, it's not just sex, but intimacy is not just a thing that you have with your spouse. It's something that I was able to cultivate with safe men. And being able to cultivate actual intimacy with safe men was a game changer for me early in my recovery, and learning that that's actually that's where I need to go with some of this stuff in this time period with this space for my life.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the things that I had written down is, is there a safe place where we often talk about at the workshop, Greg, I know I hear you say this quite a bit, is that percentage, and I know you change the percentage all the time, but it's that 20%, 10, 15%, do I have a place where I've gone with that? I think one of the biggest mistakes is I've held back something, and that's usually where the shame sits.
Right.
So I'm keeping myself in that spot of hiding. And I know Mark used to say, that was one of the most important things for him in the beginning was he had a community where he could just share his whole story, and was invited into that process.
Well, so what we could say is one of the things that men would identify wasn't helpful was not to be open and honest and fully transparent at the beginning.
Okay.
What Jim's referring to is I talked to the men, the counseling center that I went to would often say, the stuff that you're not talking about the most is the stuff that defines you the most. And typically we have that last 10%, and Jim's correct, it does change. So it could be the last 20%, but it's that part of our story that we are afraid is too much. And I know even working with men doing full disclosures, I'll often ask them, what's the detail that you're afraid is too much for your spouse that you want to hold on to? And so one of the things that I've heard men say is they wish that they had trusted the process, trusted the community, and was able to be more and fully honest at the very beginning. And the more that we hold on to in our recovery, the more chaos it's going to create later.
Yeah. And, one of the things I often talk about is, practicing sharing that with guys who've been through similar experiences sets you up to do that well with your spouse. And so we often talk about, how it doesn't go well in the marriage is that installment plan. I've shared a little bit, time after time with my spouse, so the spouse is continually getting re-traumatized by information.
Right. One thing I want to identify, and this was true for me, it took me a while to understand this, is, so for those of you that know my story, I was called into an office, I got fired, my parts of my story were exposed, and in that moment, to the best of my ability, I began recovery. Well, what's true, using the language we use here at Faithful and True, still it was my survivor man that was driving the bus. And so one of the things that's true is early in recovery, some of the choices that we make, even though they are good choices, are being made by that survivor man. And good choices made by survivor man had less benefit and result in less transformation.
Well, I think that's the benefit of the group, isn't it? Is because we're in the fog of our addiction, we don't see clearly.
Right.
When we're in our survivor man place, when you're in that part of your brain, it's not in your rational brain. So literally you're not in your right mind when you're making these decisions. And so part of the benefit of community, or one of them, is that you're brought back into reality, you're brought back into the rational place, and you start to see, other people can see things that you cannot see. And I think that that's true for people that want to, frequently, well, people that immediately after discovery, they want to go through full disclosure as their first step. And that often doesn't go very well, in part because I think the man needs to be able to disclose to a group, other men, where he feels safe doing it, and practice doing it fully, either with an individual counselor or with a group or both. So we can get that whole 100% out. It's always surprising me, I don't know if you've noticed this over the years, that it's not always the sexual sin that they're holding back. Sometimes it's other stuff that they're even more ashamed about. And they think, oh, I just have to disclose all my sexual sin. Well, you need to disclose everything. You need to have that total honesty where every part of whatever is causing you shame, you need to let that all the way out, so that you know that if your wife knows everything and she says, I love you, she means it. And that's the first step of reducing shame, which is, I think, one of the key positive things you can do at the beginning of recovery is immediately start working on that shame.
Right.
And with the disclosure, Russ, some guys early on, they don't know what they need to disclose because they haven't even thought about it, you know what I mean, until we bring it up to them. And so that can cause problems. So it's not so much they're willingly not offering them the information. They just haven't thought about it.
Right.
Well, I would say, kind of along what Russ was saying, so if I don't have a lot of wise men on my bus, I need a lot of other wise men on my bus because they provide the wise man that I don't have yet.
Right.
And so one of the things I look back on early in my recovery, I was very alone and isolated. And so basically I knew, I didn't have this language, but I knew that I didn't want my survivor man driving the bus. I didn't have much wise man, so who that left was my little boy. And I look back at those early days of recovery and after the explosion and exposure, how much of my little boy was active and how traumatizing it was for my little boy. And so kind of in a broad term, I think a lot of men would say, one of the things that they wish they had done differently was to get engaged in community more quickly. One of the things that they did well, for those that did it, was find community. Those that didn't do it well, they were slow to engage community.
And I think it's important to put the active verb in that, not I need to have a community, this passive state of being in community. It's I need to pursue it. Learning to pursue intimacy with safe men is a really hard skill. I still remember the moment. I was at the YMCA. I was walking up the stairs. I'd just done some working out, which maybe we'll get to using the body as a good early in recovery. But I sent a text out to the group here at Faithful and True that I was part of. And it was the first time I had sent a text to a group of men of this sort that wasn't responding to somebody else's needs or something, and I didn't have anything to say. I was just doing it because, well, Mark told me to, but just to bring them into what I was doing during the day. Right. And it was this formative moment for me that I am bringing other men into my life, not because I have this immediate need, not because, for no other reason than I'm pursuing intimacy and living life together with them. And so this active, not just sitting there, man, I wish I had good, safe men around me and community. We've got group, we have opportunity. We have to learn to pursue that intimacy early in recovery, and some of the energy that we have early in recovery, the adrenaline, to be able to focus that towards some of this other work.
Right. Well, and I would even add, it's not just a good group of guys. I may have a good group of guys. I think the men, and this was true for me, they really begin to move forward in recovery when they have a structured group of community. It was, my life exploded in August. It was in January that I began my therapy group. And my therapy group was not just about sex addiction. It wasn't about addiction itself. It was just an emotional health therapy group that was co-ed. And it was a game changer for me because I didn't know how to do community. And because it was a structured group, they provided the guidelines of how you do community. There were some specific things that you were to do or not to do. One of the things I remember being so first confusing but clarifying was one of the guidelines was if someone reached out to you in the community with a need, you could not coattail on that text with your need. You had to just hear what it was that they were saying. You had to respond to them, but you couldn't just kind of throw your need in there too. And I didn't like it. And what it taught me was I have to be intentional, very much like you were saying. I couldn't wait for someone to reach out to me, because even if somebody reached out to me, the guidelines of the group was this is supposed to be about them. I had to learn the discipline of when I had a need or I just wanted to include somebody in my day, I had to take the initiative. And so I would say for those men who find structured groups that have guidelines, have support, are led by professionals if possible, or have a very structured way of functioning, those are the men that really do well. And a lot of men would say one of the things I wished I had done differently was find that group or get involved in that group more quickly.
I think, one of the popular phrases right now is the opposite of addiction is community. And what's also true is I wouldn't have been able to tell you what that word meant.
Right.
And so it might be helpful to talk a little bit about what community actually is in a very practical way. And so I'll start, if that's okay. One thing we talk about all the time in group is accountability. And people will frequently say, I need you guys to keep me accountable. And that's a passive way of engaging with people. And it actually feeds into a little bit of the victim place of the addict, that I need somebody else to keep me in line. And I try and get guys to say, this is what accountability looks like. Accountability is, hey, I'd like you to be on my Covenant Eyes account or whatever the browsing software is that you're using. And I'm going to commit to you that I'm going to call you every 2 weeks, every month, whatever. And I'm going to go over my account with you. Would you be willing to be accountable with me there? That's accountability. You're initiating, you're taking charge, you're just asking permission that they walk along with you in that. You're not waiting on your phone. You acted out, you had a slip, and you're waiting for your Covenant Eyes guys to call you and tell you, hey, I caught you. Right. It's you being actively engaged in that, and that's much more effective. And I don't know, that's the first thing that pops into my mind.
And I would even say, and when I am passive, I engage my passivity in an active way. What's true is most of us who struggle with addiction have components of passivity. And that's one of the things that we're trying to move away from. So we're not going to do this perfectly. There's not going to be every time that I reach out and say, oh, here's what my accountability software is going to say. Yeah. The reality, though, is I have to continue to re-engage my passivity so that I can move towards activity. Even if I just own, hey, I want to own I didn't reach out about my accountability report, or I need to own I told you that I would check in after I had that conversation or that appointment and I didn't do that. Yeah. That brings me back into activity versus just passivity.
Yeah, well, I think the other term with that is reactivity. As what Josh was talking about, am I being reactive or being intentional? And oftentimes a lot of guys that have struggled with addiction, they've come from environments where they've had to be reactive. So one of the things they are recovering is the ability to take their own initiative with life.
One of the images that I use is growing up, when I was in PE, we had to play dodgeball. And I was not good at dodgeball, but I was skinny and I was fast, so I could dodge the ball, but I never threw the ball.
So you were good at half of it.
Yes, half of it.
You're good at dodge.
The dodge
not so much
part.
The ball.
Right, yeah. And so what you learn quickly is you're never going to win a game if all you're doing is dodging the ball. In fact, you get into a horrible position when you're the last one left and everyone else has the balls and now it's become a firing squad. But if we live our life simply trying to dodge the balls that are coming at us, that makes sense when we're children.
Right.
And I'm glad that you said that. For many of us, we learn to survive as children by just dodging what's coming at us. But at some point as adults, we begin to re-engage the game fully. And we need otherwise men modeling that for us, encouraging us, validating us, affirming us to begin to really more engage what is going on versus just respond to what is going on or reacting.
Yeah, and I'd love to use that actually as a bridge with this language of community and accountability. One of the things that I found especially helpful as well was that, we talk about the first step in our addiction is isolation, the first step in recovery is community, is pursuing community. So it's always this movement. But I came into it, and I know a lot of men that I've worked with, they hold an enormous amount of shame in early recovery, an enormous amount of shame. And sometimes for good reasons. There are things of which I feel ashamed in my history, okay? Part of the group work was for me to be able to reclaim things that I'm good at, things that I'm actually good at, and reclaiming that not with even my wife, because it can have that tinge of so that she'll really be impressed and like me, But with these men that know the worst kinds of things about, the worst things I've done, they know it. They've been there, they hear me every week, they are not impressed by me. And to reclaim in that kind of community, this is what I'm good at, and this is who I want to become. The accountability bit is not just keep me accountable away from that, but accountable towards this. And so being able to reclaim assertiveness of a kind that I actually am still worthwhile.
Right.
All of this stuff is true, and I have to have a place where I can say, and I still have gifts.
Right.
And a group of men that can affirm that, which isn't just patting on the back, but it's pulling out of that isolation, which is where addiction grows.
Right. And I would even say part of the role of the group is to recalibrate us back into the truth. The shame and the addiction has kind of distorted our lives around lies, and the lies hold us in bondage, but community invites us into truth. And one of the things I would say, in talking to men about the early days of recovery, one of their things that they would say I would do over again is I would steward my group more fully. If you come to our workshop, you hear about being in a group. That's one of the things that we're going to talk a lot about, because we don't think you can recover without being in a group. But it's not just about attendance. Nobody experiences recovery through attendance. It is through active participation. It is through showing up and bringing yourself. And it is one of the advantages of groups that are structured is there's an intentional opportunity to check in. There's an intentional invitation. And the way that I do my groups, the expectation is you will share every single time. And there are probably times that men show up. In fact, I know this because they'll say, oh, I don't want to share today. But if I show up knowing that that's the expectation, there's less space to hide. And we're all good at hiding. And so if there's a crowded room and there's a place for us to be silent, we're going to find those out. And we do need that invitation either from the leader or for the other men to invite us, not force us, not coerce us, not manipulate us, but often to invite us into being able to be present in the room.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Can I add an additional thing? Can we shift just?
Right.
Okay. So one of the other things I wanted to kind of address is getting the right help early. Because I think we've all experienced, couples or guys that have come, maybe they didn't meet with a counselor up front that specialized in this, because addiction is very complex. It's not a simple issue to work with. But maybe they came from couples work. They started this whole work doing marriage therapy, and I'm like, how do you start marriage therapy? Or maybe, the therapist didn't believe in sex addiction at all, or maybe they thought it was just a sexual difference in sexual desire for frequency.
Right.
And so I had a guy one time that came in, and he was like, my therapist just said I need to masturbate, a little bit more.
Right.
If my wife doesn't want to have sex with me. And I'm like, that didn't help him out too much.
That's right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think specialized help that really understands the complexity of addiction.
And I would say that not all recovery experiences are created equally.
Yeah.
And I was just having a conversation with Deb Laaser, the founder of Faithful and True, with her husband Mark, and this idea of paying attention to your intuition. I often tell the story that when prior to recovery, I was still way in the fog of chaos and confusion. And I found enough courage to go to a therapist and share a little bit of my story. And I often say, I can own I was minimizing. I was minimizing what I was doing. I was minimizing how significant it was to me. I was minimizing kind of the way I was using it. I was minimizing. What's also true is because the therapist wasn't familiar with sexual addiction, he also minimized it. And what ended up happening was he told me exactly what I wanted to hear. And my intuition told me this is not correct, but I left that session satisfied even though I knew it wasn't going to be helpful. And so one of the things that we're going to encourage people to do is pay attention to your own intuition. Well, this topic of finding good help is significant enough that we're going to continue, and we're going to follow this up with a part 2, and we're going to do another podcast on this idea of what was done early that was helpful, what was done early that wasn't helpful. And so my assumption is y'all will all be here. Where else would you be?
Absolutely.
And we'll continue this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg.
Well, thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that this show and this conversation was beneficial to you. If this conversation has awakened an understanding within you that you need help for a problem that you've been trying to deal with along the lines of unwanted, uncontrollable sexual behavior, we invite you to visit faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll see many resources that will be helpful to you, as well as information and registration opportunities for the Men's Journey Workshop. Go to faithfulandtrue.com, click on the Men's Journey Workshop, and there you'll find a video that answers the most frequently asked questions that men have about the 3-day workshop, as well as many resources, our online store, and over 400 podcasts like this. We hope all of these resources will be helpful to you, and we hope that this coming week will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.